Deep in the heart of Kentucky's Appalachian backwoods, a family kept its bloodline locked away for more than 7 generations. Cousin to cousin, father to daughter, marriages that defied morality and law alike. Behind closed doors, children were born with unsettling features, twisted by secrets too dark to confront. What they left behind was not just deformity, but a haunting legacy, one that still whispers through the hollows of America's forgotten past. Welcome to Hidden Docks, where the stories buried beneath America's soil are brought back into the light. This is not the history you read in school books, but the forbidden truths that families and towns swore to silence. Today, we journey into Kentucky's most disturbing secret, a clan that married within its own blood for 7 generations, leaving behind a trail of haunting lives and broken legacies. Stay with us, because the deeper we go into these Appalachian hills, the darker the story becomes. The story begins in the late 1800s, in the thick, tangled woods of eastern Kentucky. Back then, this land was a world of its own. Roads were unpaved. Rivers were the only reliable passage, and the Appalachian hills formed a wall between the rest of the nation and those who lived within them. It was here, in this isolation, that a family chose secrecy over connection, creating a shadowed legacy that would stretch across generations. The people who settled these hills were already hardened by poverty. Farming the rocky soil gave little. Coal mining was dangerous and scarce, and outside help rarely reached this far into the wilderness. For many, survival meant clinging to what you had, and for some families, that meant clinging to each other. In this desperate isolation, bonds of kinship blurred into something far darker. Among these Appalachian families was one clan that sealed itself off almost entirely from the outside world. They distrusted strangers, avoided towns, and raised their children with a single unspoken rule: outsiders could not be trusted, and marriage should remain within the bloodline. It began quietly, almost invisibly, with cousins marrying cousins. But as the years passed, that secrecy turned into a cage, trapping generation after generation within the same family tree. Whispers began to spread among neighboring communities. Stories of children born with unusual features, sunken eyes, uneven faces, and hauntingly pale skin. Some were said to struggle with their minds, unable to learn or behave in ways the outside world would consider normal. Yet the family clung tighter to its secrecy, retreating further into the hollows, as if the hills themselves were protecting them from discovery. The clan's isolation was not only physical but spiritual. They convinced themselves that their way of life was a form of protection, a shield against the corruption of the outside world. They painted their secrecy as strength, even righteousness. But behind closed doors, it was becoming something far more sinister. A cycle of marriages and births that left children bearing the weight of choices they never made. By the turn of the century, this family was already spoken of in hushed tones. Locals who lived near the ridge avoided their land. Children were warned not to wander too close, told tales of strange-looking figures watching from the tree line. And still, no one dared intervene. Poverty was too common, shame was too heavy, and in a land this far removed from authority, what happened in the hollows stayed in the hollows. The roots of their secret were planted deep. What began as a way to keep blood pure was already spiraling into something that would mark their descendants forever. And yet, the family believed they were safe, protected by the hills that kept the outside world at bay. They didn't realize that their isolation was not protection, it was a prison, because soon the consequences of their choices would begin to show in ways no one could ignore. As the 20th century approached, the clan's isolation became more than a matter of geography. It became a matter of belief. In the hollows of Kentucky, faith was often the only comfort families could hold on to. For this clan, faith twisted into something dangerous, something that would justify the choices that bound them together and kept outsiders away. Religion, here, was rigid, and unyielding. The family interpreted scripture not as a guide to morality, but as a weapon to defend their insular way of life. Passages about purity, obedience, and the dangers of outsiders were preached around the dinner table like sermons. Children were raised to believe that their blood was sacred, that mingling with outsiders would taint the family and bring ruin. What might have been mere superstition elsewhere became law in these hills. In the absence of education and contact with the wider world, fear of outsiders grew into fanaticism. Strangers were not just distrusted, they were seen as dangerous. Townsfolk were painted as corrupt, cities as dens of sin. Only the family could be trusted. Only the family was safe. This doctrine, repeated generation after generation, became a cage. It left young men and women with no choice but to marry the cousins, uncles, or even step-siblings that surrounded them. Every marriage was justified as keeping the blood pure. Each child born was held up as proof that God favored the families. Choices, even when that child bore the physical and mental toll of generations of inbreeding. Deformities, speech delays, and strange behaviors were explained away as trials sent from above, tests of faith. Rather than warning signs, they became part of the family's identity, woven into the myth they built around themselves. Neighbors began to notice. Families in nearby towns whispered about children who didn't look like other children. Children who avoided eye contact, who stumbled when they spoke, who seemed trapped in a world of their own. But in a place where poverty was common and medical help was scarce, these differences were easy to ignore or easier still to dismiss as mountain hardships, and so the silence continued. The family's fear of outsiders only deepened as rumors spread. They grew more secretive, retreating further into their land, cutting off the little contact they once had. Outsiders were not welcomed, and those who dared to trespass were met with cold stares and doors slammed shut. The clan's beliefs, once whispered, were now enforced as law inside their walls. And within those walls, marriages continued, daughter to father, cousin to cousin, generation after generation. Each union sealed the family's fate tighter, narrowing their world until the outside seemed like a distant threat, and the inside became the only reality. But even in the deepest hollows, secrets cannot stay buried forever. The children born of these unions carried the truth in their faces, their voices, their struggles, and sooner or later, someone outside the clan would come close enough to see. The true cost of the family's choices was etched onto the bodies and minds of their children. By the early 1900s, the toll of 7 generations of inbreeding could no longer be hidden behind closed doors. The children born within this clan carried the evidence, haunting, undeniable, and impossible to ignore. Some were born with twisted features, sunken eyes that seemed too large for their faces, jaws that jutted unevenly, or skin that carried an unnatural pallor. Others displayed neurological scars, children who could not speak in full sentences, who flinched from strangers, who rocked back and forth in eerie silence. Their behaviors became whispers in neighboring towns, fueling rumors of a cursed bloodline hidden deep within the hollows. One account describes children with bright, pale eyes that seemed vacant, as though they were looking past the world rather than into it. Locals claimed they rarely spoke to outsiders, communicating in grunts, gestures, or a language that only the family seemed to understand. For those who caught fleeting glimpses, the children were more than unsettling. They were terrifying, reminders of what happens when nature is forced to turn inward, generation after generation. And yet, within the family's walls, these children were not treated as victims, but as proof of loyalty. Their deformities, their struggles, their differences were explained away as divine burdens. Parents told themselves that God had chosen their family to carry these trials, twisting faith into justification. Outsiders may have seen weakness, but inside, these children were seen as symbols of the clan's resilience, martyrs for the purity of their bloodline. The cruelty of this belief system meant that no child, no matter how fragile, was spared from the cycle. Girls as young as 11 or 12 were promised to older cousins or uncles. Boys were taught that their only duty was to protect and continue the bloodline. Childhood in this family was not a season of innocence. It was preparation for another link in the chain, another marriage that would close the door on escape. The physical isolation of the family magnified the psychological one. Children rarely, if ever, attended schools. Doctors were almost never called. Generations grew up without books, without teachers, without the faintest glimpse of life beyond the hills. In their minds, the world ended at the tree line. To them, there was nothing beyond it, only danger, sin, and strangers who must never be trusted. But the whispers grew louder. Neighbors passing along dirt roads would tell of pale faces peering out from behind rotting curtains. Hunters claimed to hear strange voices echoing in the woods, a blend of cries and laughter that sounded more animal than human. These stories only fed the fear that surrounded the family, keeping outsiders away and tightening the shroud of secrecy. The children themselves became living legends, fragments of a story too strange, too disturbing to dismiss. And though the family believed the hills would always keep them safe, their very children were carrying a truth too haunting to remain hidden forever. Because soon, outsiders would not just whisper about the clan, they would come seeking answers. For decades, the family's secrets were shielded by the wilderness. The Appalachian backwoods acted like a fortress, where whispers of deformities and strange children could fade into myth. But by the mid-20th century, that fortress began to crack. Outsiders were coming closer: teachers, census workers, wandering doctors, and they were not so easily frightened away. The first encounters were almost accidental. A school teacher assigned to the region in the 1940s recalled visiting a one-room shack perched on a ridge. Inside, she found half a dozen children, barefoot, unwashed, and mute. When she tried to coax their names from them, they only stared or made guttural sounds. The teacher, unsettled, wrote in her logbook that it was as if she had stepped into a place where time itself had stopped. Doctors who ventured into the hills found more disturbing evidence. They noted severe congenital disorders, club feet, cleft palates, crossed eyes, and cognitive delays that spanned generations. One physician quietly remarked that the family's genetic pool had been circling the drain for far too long. But in a region already plagued by poverty and isolation, there was little appetite for intervention. The state turned a blind eye, chalking it up as just another tragic corner of rural America. Not all outsiders were motivated by compassion. By the 1950s and 60s, journalists began sniffing around. Small-town papers published sensational headlines about the clan of the Kentucky Hollers and the children born of sin. Reporters spoke of encountering children with shockingly pale skin, adults who recoiled from questions, and entire households where no one could read or write. For the family, this intrusion felt like a siege. They had guarded their bloodline for 7 generations, and now strangers were dragging their private world into the light. Some members lashed out, threatening journalists who came too close. Others simply vanished deeper into the woods, building shacks even further from town, as if physical distance could protect them from prying eyes. But the harder they tried to hide, the more fascination grew. Neighbors whispered to newcomers, "Don't go near that ridge after dark. Don't look too long if you see their children. Just keep walking." Fear became folklore, and folklore fed curiosity. Each passing decade pulled the family further into unwanted attention, turning their lives into a grotesque spectacle. And yet, no matter how much outsiders speculated, one thing was clear: no one truly understood the depths of what was happening inside the family. Every rumor, every report was only a shadow of the truth. The darkest realities, the arranged unions, the ritual of marrying within, the deliberate sealing off of bloodlines, remained locked inside the family walls. But it was only a matter of time before someone pried those walls open. Because while neighbors whispered and journalists speculated, researchers and genealogists were preparing to uncover the clan's entire history, and they would drag every dark secret into the public eye. By the late 20th century, the whispers had become too loud to ignore. Local doctors, curious journalists, and even government workers had seen enough to suspect that the stories were not just folklore. But it wasn't until genealogists and researchers began digging into old county records that the true scope of the family's history came into view. And what they uncovered was nothing short of horrifying. At first, the paper trails seemed ordinary. Birth certificates, marriage licenses, and census logs scattered across small Kentucky counties. But as researchers pieced them together, strange patterns emerged. The same surnames repeated again and again, often within the same household. Brothers marrying sisters, first cousins listed as spouses, birth records that blurred the line between parent and sibling. The family tree wasn't branching out. It was folding in on itself, like a snake eating its own tail. One genealogist described it as a lineage trapped in a loop. For 7 generations, marriages had occurred almost exclusively within the same clan. Outsiders were rare, and when they did appear in the records, their children often vanished from the documentation, as if absorbed or erased by the dominant bloodline. The deeper researchers looked, the darker it became. Records revealed children born with no listed father, only to appear years later as cousins, who were suddenly recognized within the family circle. In some cases, it seemed fathers had sired children with their own daughters, cementing a cycle of abuse and genetic collapse. But paper alone could only tell part of the story. Interviews with locals filled in the rest. Neighbors recalled seeing children who struggled to speak, adults who could not hold down work, and entire households living in such poverty that survival itself became a daily struggle. One man remembered walking past a shack and hearing what sounded like wailing, not words, but deep, guttural cries. He said it chilled him to the bone, as if the family was haunted from the inside out. By the 1980s and 1990s, academic interest grew. Geneticists began linking the family to recessive disorders, pointing out how repeated intermarriage amplified rare conditions. The results explained the deformities, the speech problems, and the fragile health that plagued generation after generation. But while scientists saw it as a case study, the reality for the family was far more tragic. It was life, and life without escape. Each new revelation shocked the public further. What had once been whispered rumors was now being mapped out in detail, showing a chain of marriages and births that defied social and moral boundaries. And yet, even as the evidence mounted, one chilling question remained. Why had they continued? What force compelled the family to keep repeating the cycle long after the rest of the world had moved on? That question would lead researchers deeper into the psychological and cultural forces that bound the clan together. Because behind every document, behind every disturbing name on the family tree, was something darker than mere biology. There was choice, tradition, and perhaps even a twisted form of loyalty that ensured the cycle would never break. To outsiders, it seemed unthinkable. How could a family continue marrying within its own bloodline for generation after generation? Was it ignorance, desperation, or something more sinister? The answer, researchers found, was tangled deep within the psychology of isolation. For much of its history, this Kentucky clan lived in near total seclusion. Hidden deep in the Appalachian backwoods, far from towns and railroads, they developed their own closed system of survival. Roads were scarce, jobs were nearly non-existent, and education rarely reached the hollow. In such an environment, the family turned inward, literally. With no fresh blood coming in, cousins became spouses, siblings became partners, and the cycle fed itself. But isolation wasn't just physical. It was cultural. Generations of poverty carved a mindset that outsiders couldn't be trusted. Stories tell of children being warned never to wander beyond the hollow, never to speak with strangers, and never to question family traditions. To leave was to betray the bloodline. To marry outside was to bring shame. What started as survival slowly transformed into a twisted form of loyalty, where the family's very identity was tied to keeping the bloodline pure, even if it meant destroying themselves in the process. Psychologists who studied similar cases across Appalachia noted a phenomenon they called genetic imprisonment. Once the cycle of inbreeding begins, it often becomes harder for families to break free. Children born with disabilities or deformities are less likely to find partners outside the family, reinforcing dependence on the clan itself. Over time, the family stops seeing the behavior as taboo. It becomes normalized, woven into daily life, passed down like a secret heirloom no one dares to challenge. There was also the element of fear. Several locals claimed that patriarchs of the family enforced strict control over who married whom. Fathers dictated unions, cousins were paired off before they came of age, and anyone who resisted risked being ostracized, or worse. Some whispered that threats and violence ensured compliance, binding each new generation to the same destructive path. The isolation also bred superstition. Oral histories suggest the family believed their hollow was cursed, that leaving it would bring ruin or death. Instead of breaking the cycle, they clung to it, convinced that survival meant staying together, even if together meant tearing themselves apart. By the 1990s, when journalists began investigating, many family members seemed unaware of how unusual their lives appeared to the outside world. To them, this was simply how things had always been. Marrying kin wasn't shocking. It was expected. One reporter described it chillingly. It wasn't that they didn't know it was wrong. It was that they no longer saw it at all. And yet, beneath the surface, there were cracks. A few younger family members began whispering about escape, about marrying beyond the hollow. But breaking away was never easy. Poverty, dependence, and the stigma attached to their name made escape nearly impossible. Many who tried to leave eventually returned, bound by the same forces that had trapped their parents and grandparents. The cycle wasn't just biological. It was psychological, cultural, generational. A curse passed down not by superstition, but by circumstance and fear. And as researchers dug deeper, they began to realize that the greatest tragedy wasn't the deformities or the disabilities. It was the family's inability to see a way out. For generations, the family had lived in the shadows, tucked away in a Kentucky hollow few outsiders dared to visit. But by the late 20th century, whispers of their existence began leaking into nearby towns. Locals spoke in hushed tones about a family different from the rest, people with strange appearances, unsettling behaviors, and a reputation that carried a mix of pity and fear. It wasn't until the 1990s that the wider world truly came face to face with them. A photographer named Shelby Lee Adams, known for documenting Appalachian life, captured haunting portraits of rural families in Kentucky. His images, stark and unfiltered, stunned audiences. In them were gaunt children, vacant-eyed men, and women whose faces told stories of hardship carved by decades of isolation. Many of these families, critics claimed, were tied to the same inbred bloodline. The photographs, while controversial, opened a door the clan had spent centuries keeping shut. Then, in the early 2000s, a journalist from a regional paper ventured into the hollow after hearing decades-old rumors. What he found was a family barely surviving, locked in poverty, with conditions that seemed more fitting for the 1800s than the modern era. Some members barely spoke, communicating instead with grunts or gestures. Others showed clear signs of genetic disorders, from facial deformities to cognitive impairment. His reporting described the scene as a living time capsule of Appalachian isolation, where progress never arrived. The public's reaction was a mix of horror and fascination. For some, it confirmed the darkest stereotypes about the Appalachian backwoods. For others, it raised ethical questions. Was documenting this family exploitation, or was it exposing a hidden tragedy that needed attention? But the real shift came when videos began surfacing. Independent documentarians who followed Adams's work traveled to the Hollow with cameras. One series captured interactions with family members that left viewers unsettled. In one clip, a man communicated with animal-like sounds, while relatives stood silently nearby, offering no explanation. These images spread across the internet, turning the clan into an unwilling spectacle. The family had become a mirror, reflecting not only their own suffering but also the deep, unspoken realities of generational poverty in America. Viewers debated endlessly. Was this the result of choice, of cultural tradition, or of a system that had abandoned the Appalachian poor long ago? And yet, even with national attention, little changed for the family. Journalists would arrive, capture their stories, and vanish again, leaving them in the same hollow, trapped in the same cycle. The outside world looked on with morbid curiosity, but few offered real help. The exposure created its own kind of prison. The family, once hidden in secrecy, was now known to millions as the most inbred clan in America. This label followed them everywhere, reinforcing their isolation. For the younger generation, it meant that even if they wanted to escape, the world already knew their name and judged them for it. The Hollow, once invisible, was now infamous. But with that infamy came a disturbing truth. Their suffering wasn't over. In some ways, it had only just begun. Once the world had seen them, there was no going back. The Hollow was no longer just another patch of forgotten land in rural Kentucky. It had become a stage. And the family living there, once unknown outside their narrow world, became unwilling actors in a drama scripted by outsiders. Documentaries labeled them the most inbred family in America. Tabloids exaggerated their deformities, while internet forums turned them into grotesque curiosities, stripping away any shred of dignity. The family story, once whispered in mountain towns, now spread across the nation and eventually the globe. But behind the sensational headlines lay something far more complex. Trauma that spanned generations. Children grew up never knowing anything beyond the Hollow, inheriting not just the physical consequences of inbreeding, but the psychological scars of poverty, ridicule, and abandonment. For many, the outside world was terrifying, a place they didn't understand and that didn't understand them. The family's transformation into legend also revealed America's fascination with the grotesque. They became symbols of backward Appalachia, of genetic consequence, of the cost of isolation. Yet this fascination often drowned out the reality. They were human beings, caught in circumstances not of their own making. Experts in sociology and genetics began weighing in. Some argued that what had happened to the clan was not simply a story of inbreeding but of neglect, proof of what happens when an entire region is left behind by progress. Others said their condition stood as a living reminder of the dangers of intermarriage within close kin. And while academics debated, the family remained in their hollow, unchanged by the discussions surrounding them. What made it more tragic was how their myth grew larger than their reality. In towns nearby, locals spoke of them like phantoms. Children were told not to wander into the woods, lest they encounter one of the clan. Strangers from far away would make pilgrimages into the backroads, hoping to catch a glimpse of the family they had seen in viral videos. For the clan, privacy became impossible. The trauma deepened with each new wave of attention. Family members who had never asked to be known now found themselves etched into documentaries, photographs, and internet lore. They could not walk into town without being stared at. Even those who showed no visible signs of deformity carried the weight of the surname that tied them to the Hollow. And yet, despite all of this, they endured. Generation after generation, the family found ways to survive, through silence, through seclusion, and through a resilience that, in its own way, was remarkable. Their story was not just about genetics or isolation. It was about how people endure when the world refuses to see them as human. The Kentucky clan had become a legend, yes, but legends rarely tell the full story. Behind every whispered tale of deformity or horror lay a truth far more haunting, that America had watched them suffer for generations and done nothing to stop it. By the time the world knew their name, the Kentucky clan had already become the subject of folklore. But as curiosity grew, so did the tales. Some were rooted in truth, others blurred into myth. Together, they created a chilling portrait of a family trapped between fact and legend. Neighbors spoke of strange sounds echoing through the woods at night, animal-like calls that weren't from animals at all. Hunters told stories of stumbling across barefoot figures deep in the forest, staring with wide, unblinking eyes before vanishing into the trees. To outsiders, these whispers only reinforced the idea that the hollow was cursed, a place where the rules of normal life did not apply. But the most disturbing accounts came from those few who ventured into the family's world. Visitors described homes that seemed frozen in another century, dirt floors, broken furniture, walls patched with tin. Inside, family members moved silently, some unable to form words, others communicating in grunts or shrill sounds. One documentarian recalled entering a dimly lit shack where a man crouched in the corner, eyes darting, emitting guttural noises while his relatives stood by without alarm. For the visitor, it felt less like stepping into a house than into a world forgotten by time. Then there were the children. Many accounts spoke of youngsters with unsettling features, pale, hollow-eyed, with movements that seemed delayed or uncoordinated. Some were said to wander aimlessly, staring at the sky, for long stretches, as if disconnected from the reality around them. Whether these observations were exaggerated or not, they became part of the narrative that outsiders carried back into towns, fueling the legend further. Not all tales painted them as victims. Some whispered of aggression, that trespassers were met with hostility, that the clan protected their territory fiercely. Old-timers claimed the family would run outsiders off with stones, or simply glare with such intensity that no one dared return. Whether out of fear or respect, locals rarely interfered with the hollow. The result was a cycle that only deepened their isolation. Rumors kept people away, and that distance allowed the family's condition to persist unnoticed, generation after generation. For every researcher or journalist who tried to peel back the layers of truth, dozens more fed into the folklore, embellishing the story until fact and fiction became inseparable. The hollow itself began to feel like a character in the tale, a dark, wooded cradle that hid the family from the outside world while amplifying their legend. In time, the clan became not just a family, but a symbol, the embodiment of all America's fears about inbreeding, poverty, and the shadows lurking in forgotten corners of the country. And yet beneath the whispers and the myths, there was still an unanswered question. How much of this story was science, and how much was sensationalism? Were they simply victims of genetics and neglect? Or had their lives been twisted by the stories others told about them? The truth, perhaps, was darker than either. For years, whispers circled through Appalachia, but nothing prepared the outside world for the raw truth of what lay hidden in Kentucky's forgotten hollow. By the early 2000s, researchers and journalists pieced together fragments of the family's past, and what they found was more tragic than any rumor. Generations of marriages within the same bloodline had carved a pattern into the family's DNA. Scientists explained it as genetic bottlenecking, where the lack of new blood leads to disorders that grow more severe with each generation. What had begun with cousin marriages escalated to father-daughter and uncle-niece unions, each one shrinking the pool of healthy genes. The results were written on the bodies and minds of their children. Deformities, impaired speech, cognitive struggles, and in some cases, silence that could not be broken. Journalists who entered the hollow described scenes that felt like stepping into another century. One reported finding 3 siblings huddled in a single room, the air thick with the smell of decay, while an elderly woman sat rocking silently, her eyes vacant, her body frail. Another recalled a moment when a man attempted to speak but could only produce guttural sounds, his brother standing beside him, interpreting gestures into broken words. These encounters left outsiders shaken, not only by what they saw, but by the realization that this family had been allowed to suffer unseen for decades. What made the story even darker was the complicity of silence. Local officials had known about the clan. Doctors, church leaders, and townsfolk were all aware of the family's condition, but few intervened. Poverty was so widespread in the region that many dismissed their plight as just another backwoods family. In reality, the clan's isolation had been preserved not just by geography, but by neglect, by a society that turned its back. When images and videos of the family surfaced online, the world reacted with a mixture of fascination and horror. Viewers called them mutants or creatures, stripping away the humanity that still existed beneath their suffering. The family became a spectacle, their lives reduced to shock value. But behind every viral clip was a deeper tragedy. People who had never chosen their circumstances, now immortalized as America's most inbred bloodline. The darkest truth was this: their suffering was preventable. With intervention, with access to education, medicine, and connection to the outside world, the cycle could have been broken generations earlier. But no one stepped in. The hollow had been left to its own devices, and in that neglect, tragedy flourished. And yet, even within this bleak legacy, there were flickers of resilience. Some younger relatives tried to escape the hollow, moving to nearby towns or seeking work in distant states. But the stigma followed them. Their surname was known, their connection to the hollow whispered wherever they went. For many, leaving meant carrying the burden of shame for a past they never created. This was the heart of the Kentucky clan story. Not just deformity, not just inbreeding, but abandonment. They were not monsters. They were victims of a cycle America chose not to break. And in that choice, their hollow became a monument to one of the darkest legacies in American history. The story of the Kentucky clan is not just a tale of inbreeding. It is a mirror reflecting America's forgotten shadows. For 7 generations, a family lived in silence, hidden in a hollow, their suffering overlooked by neighbors, officials, and an entire nation. What emerged was not a myth, but a truth darker than fiction, a legacy of isolation, neglect, and tragedy that could have been prevented. As the world gawks at their story through photographs, documentaries, and viral videos, it's easy to see them as symbols of genetic consequence, of Appalachian poverty, of rural despair. But behind those images are human beings whose lives were shaped not by choice, but by the chains of history. And perhaps that is the haunting lesson, that in America, sometimes the darkest stories aren't hidden by accident, but by design, left to rot in silence until the world stumbles upon them too late. This is Hidden Docs. If you want to uncover more of the shadows America tried to bury, stay with us, because the past has more secrets than we've been told.